Okay, bringing people into a new environment is the name of the game. Showing people the perspective of something or everything that they don't have just in their day to day life. I
Hmm.
feel like that is the key to what we're trying to do and what so many people are trying to do around the world when we're talking about change the game, creating a new world. And a man whose life, we're going to celebrate to get things started here, I think played a pivotal role and is an example of that. So right before we started recording last week, the news came down that Michael K. Williams transitioned, that he passed away. And I wanted to make sure that all of the news came out and we learned everything that we could before
Yeah.
we talked about it here. So for today's downbeat, again, to the point of bringing people into a new environment and showing them something different, we're going to hear Michael K. Williams talk a little bit to Stephen Colbert on how he put a very famous chef on to some new tastes. Let's take
It
a
was really
listen.
awesome. I was nervous, right? Because I got a call from Anthony Bourdain. I was like, okay, what is this? So I was like, well, they say he wants you to show him Brooklyn. I was like, well, I'm from the hood. Is he okay with that? I'm from Flatbush. I'm not taking him to bougie Williamsburg where I live now. We going to the hood, right? So yeah, he was down with that, man. So we're walking in my projects on the block where I'm literally was raised on, and then I took him to a restaurant in Crown Heights called Glorious, it's a Caribbean spot. I said, let me see how good you know food, right? If you know how to eat oxtails, you're my kind of guy. That dude knew how to eat oxtails. You got to eat it with your hands. You got to pick it up and just go in for you. Hold it aside, kind of go
I
around.
like I like hearing that story, and of course he's talking about Anthony Bourdain, this person who another person we've lost who we lift up as one of the ultimates when it comes to ethno food, or there must be some a word around that, the study of people and food. But the fact that Michael K. Williams could even be his bridge into something like that, this man, Anthony Bourdain, who has gone all over the world and tasted all types of food, and Michael K. Williams can bring him still into something new. I think that's just one example of the many ways that he was able to do that throughout his career, not only as an actor, but as a human being, as a person.
Ethnogastro. What would the study of ethnogastro? That's
I
what it
mean,
would
that
be.
sounds about right. Okay.
The first time that I ran into him was actually in The Sopranos. So this would have been still in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was in one episode running what he affectionately referred to as the Bootin' Holiday Inn.
Okay.
This is where one of the other characters had to go and hide out at Ray Ray's place in the Bootin' Projects. And they set him up very early on as a character that, you don't trifle with. He was smart and was also hip to what he was about. I mean, he knew why this character was there.
Yeah.
He was hiding from trying to keep from getting whacked.
Sure. He mentioned in that clip The Wire, or that the kids who are running after them may be too young to watch The Wire. I haven't seen any of The Sopranos. I also haven't seen any of The Wire. Is that a Michael K. Williams performance that you would recommend to people?
That's the one that cemented his career for sure. Omar Little as a character, though, he really threaded a needle. He really created a singular character that was so complex that I think his performance alone should be studied.
Omar Little is the character that Michael K. Williams played.
That's right.
Got it.
I always thought of him as Jesus at his angriest.
Okay.
And I don't mean, and I'm not trying to be blasphemous here, but what I'm trying to say is that when somebody needed to be smited, it was that person. There was no collateral damage. He was vicious in the street, but also behind the scenes, in private, he was very tender, a gay man. And to live that lifestyle in that world, and the way that he did it, just such a complex character.
Yeah.
And whenever you heard Omar whistle, a hunting we will go,
Okay.
somebody was about to get shot.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm really grateful to know Michael K. Williams, just through media as himself. I can't really speak to any character he ever played. I understand he was on Boardwalk Empire
Chalky
as well.
White.
So all these, all these shows that don't hit my demographic, I suppose. But I used to watch a show on Vice called Black Market Dispatches, and it just goes all around the world showing different black markets and the reasons they exist and the people, the families that are connected to them. And Michael K. Williams did a really great job of bringing somebody like me through my TV into illegal gambling halls and illegal strip clubs and the drug trade and all of that stuff as it really exists in American cities and in world cities. And
Wow. And that's called what?
it was called Black Market Dispatches. The show used to be on demand for Vice, but they sold a lot of their stuff. And I forget, maybe it's FX or something. You can find it. You won't find it for free probably, but really incredible show that really showed his heart. Michael K. Williams, even in some of the post interviews for the tapings of the show, would talk about how after they cut off the cameras, there would be full-fledged gangsters. They would take off their masks and all that stuff because their identities were being held
Anonymous,
in the
yeah.
show.
Mm-hmm.
But they would take off their masks and everything and beg Michael K. Williams to just take them with him, take them away from those streets. So
My
this is
God,
this
really?
is this is someone who really made connections with
Yeah.
these people. He was, everybody knows I listened to the Joe Budden podcast. Joe Budden talked about his many different interactions, run-ins with Michael K. Williams, and talked about how phenomenal of a photographer he was, how great of a dancer he was, how he was great at DJing, like he could scratch tapes and do all of that stuff. So really a multifaceted human being that I really wanted to make sure that we honored as we started this opus. There's so many folks out there who we don't celebrate, and unfortunately who we won't celebrate until they pass on. But rest in power and rest in peace to Michael K. Williams. As I said, just to open it up, exposing people to new perspectives and to new ideas is a vital part of progress. That's what he, tried to do with his entire life, and that's what we're trying to do here on this podcast. So
That's true.
How about we get started? I'm Garrett McQueen,
I'm Scott Blankenship.
and this is TRILLOQUY, Opus 116. Thank you, everyone, for coming along to listen to this show of ours. To the returning listeners, thank you so much for coming back week after week. We couldn't do it without you, and we are greatly indebted to your dedication to this podcast. To new folks or folks who have only come by for 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 opuses, welcome and thank you for checking it out. TRILLOQUY is a podcast built to decolonize the phrase classical music and everything that we think about when it comes to that phrase. We take the genre that we have dedicated so much of our lives to, the so-called genre, maybe I can say, and we tie it with real world events, real opinions, and everything else that puts the trill in TRILLOQUY. So here we are. Thank you very much. Support for TRILLOQUY, in addition to your support, comes from the Shuttleworth Foundation. The Shuttleworth Foundation funds individuals who are unafraid to reimagine the world and the way we live in it. For more information on the Shuttleworth Foundation, just visit shuttlefoundation.org. I also want to send a huge shout out and thank you to the McPhail Music Center here in Minnesota, over in Minneapolis. I had the honor of being the keynote speaker at their Anacrusis event. I talked about developing communities, building rapport with different communities by affirming their narratives. So often we think of people as only as bodies, individuals, different shades of humanity to check our boxes with, but we have to engage what people think and what people believe to really build those communities. So that's what I spoke to. They gave me, I'm sure you saw it, Scott, as a part of my gift, they gave me that baton over there with that really nice case. So So I guess I need to find some musicians to wave a stick at, or maybe not, but we'll see. I also want to, before we get into Movement One, send a thank you and a continued shout out to the American Composers Forum. ACF had our racial equity summit this past weekend. You can find recordings of that and links over on the ACF website, also on YouTube, I believe. And I'm going to speak to a few of the points that were made at the Racial Equity Summit in the fourth movement of this opus, in the Triloquy. But for right now, we'll hop into Movement One. All right, Scott, we're going to start with a little pop culture segment, I suppose, some mini accidentals that we're shoving into one. So how about we get started? What's the first one?
I just remember this. Give me a natural here. I need to set a natural.
Okay.
To the people who emailed me wanting to know if I suddenly had a woman in my life. If I
they're curious now.
Yeah, because
they need to know.
I said last week that I thought that Little Trip to Heaven was a wedding song and that I learned it on the guitar and all that. Go back and re-listen to what I said. I did not say that there was somebody that I was all of a sudden going to propose to. All I said was, I'm ready to play it.
Oh, I mean,
That's
they're just making sure you're still on the market. But anyway, for our little pop culture accidentals here, I'm going to go ahead and I'll get us started with not with a flat, sorry, with a sharp. Let me send a few more just to make sure. I'm starting with a sharp. So you've heard of the show Big Brother, right? You said you haven't seen an episode, but you know what basically it's about. People go into a house, voting each other out, and vying for $1 million. I used to watch it early on, like I said, maybe seasons 3 through 8 or something, and they're on season 20 something now. But,
and so they vote to kick each week. One person is voted on to get kicked off.
Right.
Does anybody ever get kicked on?
Kicked on.
Yeah. Have you ever been kicked on a show?
I don't know, and I'm gonna give that joke a flat.
Oh, that's fun.
I don't know any of my buttons today.
I'm telling you. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Anyway, so in the history of Big Brother, there has never been a black winner. Okay. I even saw a chart that said in the past 11 seasons, only one black person has made it to the final 6 contestants. So it's been, pretty locked down in there. But CBS has, I think that's who it belongs to, CBS, they have made a new rule when it comes to their reality shows. In light of all the conversations about equity and diversity, they require a certain percentage of people of color on these shows. Now, I'll start by saying that when I was watching Big Brother, it was always, never more than 2 black people, usually just one in the seasons that I watched. But that's not what the country looks like.
Right.
That's not what the world looks like. So they said they had to change something. So for this season of Big Brother, they had 6 black people. And at the beginning of the season, apparently, those 6 black folks, they got together and formed an alliance that is now known as the Cookout. So week after week, people were getting booted out of the house, losing their opportunity to get that money. Well, here we are with the final 6, and all 6 of them are who? You guessed it, members of the Cookout. Okay, so the reaction to that has been how can I say? Very spicy. I'm going to read just a little bit here. This is from ScreenRant.com. The headline is Big Brother. Julie Chen disputes claims Cookout Alliance is racist. Longtime Big Brother host Julie Chen has disputed claims that the Cookout Alliance is racist. The Cookout Alliance is made up of 6 players who are all people of color. They list the names here, and it sort of, gives some of the history of what happened this season. It says here, although the Alliance of 6 only has to survive 2 more evictions to successfully make it to the end of the game together, there is still time for things to go wrong. Last week, Julie announced that the next 2 live shows will each consist of a double eviction. If one of the 6 members does not win power during this week's double eviction, a Cookout member will be sent to the jury house. So, everything, all great things come to an end. Not all 6 people could, win the money. It's only going to be one. But as you can imagine, a lot of folks are really pissed.
So they're just changing up the rules here near the end. Now they're adding the double eviction now.
I think there've been some double evictions in the end. And
All right, well, see, I don't know. I've never seen it.
And they especially do that to sort of, get the season going, and to also make sure that the folks in the house aren't getting too bored or whatever, because you remember they're completely isolated. They have no internet, no television. There's, they're broken off from the outside world. So sometimes they have to, get some more activities going in the house, because, it's easy for it to start to feel like jail.
I'm not doing that show. I'm not doing that show.
But I mean, what do you think? What just knowing what knowing what you've heard, what are your reactions to people that say the Cookout Alliance is a racist alliance?
I'm more concerned over the idea that these people will now be pitted against one another.
Sure. That's the way capitalism rolls, though, isn't it? At some point, you got to fight each other, it seems.
It's too bad that you haven't seen any of these, because I would be interested in getting your take on who you thought might make it through.
Oh, the fight. Well, you wouldn't know them anyway.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
I mean, my thing is, when it comes to that concept of equity that no one seems to be able to understand, this is what that looks like. The network made a decision based on the conversations that have been happening, and here we are. I think it's so short-sighted to call these folks racist for banding together when you think about what I said at the very beginning of this. There has never been a black winner, and in the past 11 seasons, there's only been one black person in the top 6. So, where was the outcry when all of these alliances over these 20-something seasons of this show only had white people in it? Oh, that wasn't a problem because, well, we know. We all know.
Right.
And I really honor Julie Chen for sticking to her guns and saying, no, this is good. And as a woman of color herself, I'm sure she can, speak to the challenges of network television and reality shows and the characters that we're booked on these shows to play, because, it's always the black guy who is this or who is that. It's never just black people, on these shows until now. So I think this is a really good thing. And this is what equity looks like. So to the people who are upset, I mean, stay mad. I guess you should have been born black.
You kind of have me thinking I want to check some highlight reels or something just to see what's up.
Yeah.
But, talking about going a long time without a black winner, how about 74 years it has taken for the Miss Ireland pageant to name a black woman winner?
Yeah, I didn't even know that there were black people in Ireland.
There's black people everywhere, though, right?
I didn't know they were in Ireland.
Well,
I didn't know.
I was there in 2005, and I didn't see many.
Not, but you did see some.
I can't even for sure say that they might have been from Pakistan.
Sure. But I'm talking about blacks. You don't remember seeing any?
Not that I remember.
So that's why this is surprising to me, and this is why I felt like there weren't any black folks over there.
But you bring up a very good point. Is what did the rest of that pageant field look like? I didn't see any other pictures. Mm-hmm. So was there only one black woman even competing? Maybe
so. I mean, like I said, I don't know of a history of black folks in Ireland, but it's really great. What's her name, by the way?
Her name is Pamela Uba.
So Pamela Uba.
Congratulations, by the way.
Congratulations. Yeah, let me give you some applause. Congratulations to Pamela Uba. You said, but before we started taping, you told me that she is, first generation. Her parents moved to Ireland from somewhere else.
Right, from South Africa.
Yeah. And, through climbing the ranks, going to school, doing your crunches. I don't know. I think those pageants are a little weird in the 21st century, especially considering everything we talk about with body politics and
sure.
and all of those sorts of things, respectability, exceptionalism, all of that. And I think this is interesting because it certainly puts Irish culture in a different light, I think. When we think about the Irish woman or someone who is, just beautiful and in the context of Ireland, we're thinking of somebody with very fair skin, probably freckles and bright red hair. That's going to be different now
Very nice.
that the whole country, at least when it comes to this competition, is being represented by a black woman. I think that's
Well, in
incredible.
the article, she obviously mentioned that all of the racist commentary goes along with it. And if you know how they treated Meghan Markle. So,
Oh, sure. Ireland wasn't treating her right. I didn't know that.
No. Of course, she was up against.
I don't keep up with the Western European culture like you do. You have an affinity for those folks, but I won't push a button. I'm not going to push a button.
Yes, you are.
Oh, you're from. This is what we need to talk about. You're from Omaha,
Right.
but you say you're from Ireland.
My heritage is English and Irish.
Okay.
My mother's maiden name was Allen, and my grandmother's maiden name was Harris.
I struggle sometimes with the conversation of heritage when it comes to white folks in the United States, because how do you know? And the only reason I ask that is because there's so much I have learned about genealogy from seeing my mom map it out. Things that we think we know about ourselves or based on our last names.
Mm-hmm.
So have you done that? I'll stop there. Have you done that digging?
I have family members who have done quite a bit of genealogy study, but my grandfather on my father's side was a hell of a storyteller.
Okay.
And on my mother's side, my grandmother, she would have people in stitches spinning yarns. And so I got it orally, handed down, word of mouth is how I found out about things. But yeah.
Yeah, the other main reason I raise an eyebrow when I hear white Americans talking about heritage is because when I remember being a teenager and every white person that I ever met was Italian, allegedly. So when I hear
Okay.
or Greek or whatever, I'm like, oh, okay, all right, well, but anyway, anything else on Pamela?
Congratulations to Pamela Uba.
Yeah, Uba. Sorry, Pamela Uba. Yeah. I think this is going to be big for just the general conversation of Irish culture globally. You talk about, you love to, I see you as that guy who is, well, it's actually Murphy's instead of Guinness or whatever. Or, what is which is another conversation. But you also talk about, the idea of wearing orange or green on St. Patrick's Day. So all of these
It's very specific.
all of these little microaggressions that you throw out to people who think they know something about Ireland. Now you get to correct them when it comes to the physical appearance of someone who is beautiful and Irish. So I hope you will do that work as well.
I cannot wait to correct them.
I hope you'll do that work as well. Anything else in this little pop culture accidental that we're doing this week?
Yeah, I think I remember you saying once that you might go to an actual sporting event if they would sing the Black National Anthem.
Oh, yeah.
It happened, baby.
And they're mad. Tell me more.
And the comments are a shit show.
Well, where did it happen?
The Black National Anthem was recently sung at an NFL Monday Night Football game, so that would have been last week, yeah?
Okay.
And
so let me ask you a question real quick. What demographic is represented most on the field of these NFL teams?
Black men.
Oh, okay. Just making sure that I'm not crazy. But they're mad that the Black National Anthem was sung for those black players and for all of the players,
for the
quite
black
frankly.
people in the audience.
Yeah, the black people in the audience and the white people in the whatever other race in the audience as well. What are the words? Lift every voice.
But if you thought they were pissed off about the taking a knee, that ain't nothing.
Okay.
Compared to how pissed off.
So what have you seen?
Folks are now.
What have you seen? What's the story?
The story is there's some racist people that have had it with the NFL now. That's what it is.
Well, I mean, God bless them. I don't watch football. That is 21st century slavery, as far as I'm concerned.
But even Bill Maher has picked up the football and run with it.
Oh, even Bill Maher.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
So you got the article there that says Bill Maher says the left, in quotes, is embarrassing him. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you, Bill. And complains about the Black national anthem. That's in the Raw story. He returned to the airwaves on Friday, once again discussed his rightward shift politically. To me, when people say to me sometimes like, boy, you go after the left a lot these days. Why? Because you're embarrassing me. And I guess that the Black national anthem is part and parcel with that.
It's interesting that folks talk about folks like Bill Maher leaning to the right, because a lot of us saw it the whole time.
Black national anthem. Maybe now we should get rid of our national anthem, but I think that we should have one national anthem, Maher said.
Well, good
Just
thing.
one.
Yeah, good thing that I don't care about what he says. So
He hit you. He punched you right in the I don't give a damn.
You had to tell me who the man was. So anyway, we have folks mad about black folks climbing the ranks in reality TV. They're mad because we're winning Miss Ireland, and they're mad that our far less violent and far more uplifting national anthem is being platformed at sporting events where most of the folks who y'all are betting on and going to buy this merchandise for are black people. So, just the world as it's been. It's fine. Everything's fine. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I have to say on that. I'm just Scotty Appleseed. I'm just dropping seeds.
well, so I guess we had a sharp, a flat, and a natural in there. So
Yeah.
all of the accidentals. So let's get out of this one with a little music by Phil Lynott. Tell me a little bit about Phil Lynott, because I didn't know this name before
Yeah.
I Googled Black Irish singer.
Yeah. He is one of the founding members, frontman and bassist for Thin Lizzy.
Okay.
Which was a band formed in the late 60s, early 70s out of Dublin.
Yeah, black people have a history there, apparently.
The boys are back in town.
Yeah.
That you hear that.
Boys are back in town. The boys are back in town. That's
Yeah.
the one people know. Yeah.
And he's got a great sort of raspy voice that works with, they did a cover of Whiskey in the Jar, which was great. And you found this, Kathleen?
Yeah, there's a tune. It doesn't say tell me the band again, sorry.
Thin Lizzy.
It doesn't say this song is by Thin Lizzy. It credits Phil Lynott here. Again, this black Irishman who I didn't realize existed. So yeah, the tune is called Kathleen, subtitled A Beautiful Irish Girl. So I thought that could be some nice music to use to transition, especially with us talking about Pamela Uba, the first black Miss Ireland.
Yeah.
So here's a little bit of this tune by Phil Lynott to get us to our next accidental.
And if the song that I write is no good, won't you listen to it please anyway? And if the words that I write are misunderstood, won't you listen to them please anyway? This song is for Kathleen. Kathleen, Kathleen, a beautiful girl, Kathleen.
He reminds me
It's got me moving.
He reminds me a little bit of Bob Geldof in that recording. A little
Okay.
bit.
Bob Geldof. Don't know who that is either.
Boomtown Rats.
Oh, okay.
Nothing.
Phenomenal.
No?
Yeah. There's a lot of music out there in the world. You expect me to know all of it? Anyway, shout out to Phil Lynott. Always learning. That's what I love about doing this show, is that I'm learning as well. Black singers in Ireland, with a history there, not just this new thing. So, what that makes me ask is, how many qualified young women for Miss Ireland have there already been that were just ignored?
Yeah, that's what I was curious. Like, who else was in the pageant?
Or even in years past.
Sure,
It's
74 years worth.
Right. It's like I appreciate the reaction to the conversations around race that we're having, but it also forces some accountability out of these organizations. You're not going to tell me that Pam Uba is the first black woman or the first woman of color in Ireland to try to go
compete.
out for something like this.
Yeah.
It had me thinking about something else. It's slipped my mind for now. But what I was gonna say, listening to a beautiful Irish girl, this tune by Phil Lynott, in one of my sociology classes in undergraduate, the teacher one day, and I wish I could remember her name, but she went on this long rant. I mean, she was talking for about 20 minutes about how men specifically need to stop using the word girl in reference to grown women. And that's a conversation that a lot of people are having now. That's sort of obvious these days. But I graduated undergrad in 2010. So, back in 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12 years ago, there were conversations that seem very strange to a lot of people when it comes to this quote unquote wokeness that people complain about. And that was one. And it took me a little while to really understand what she was saying, because as a black gay man, we use the word girl to talk about everything, or she to talk about everything. This coffee, she's strong, stuff like that. But I just wanted to name that before, we get into this next accidental, especially considering that song. It's titled, this is from the New York Times, "Top Orchestras Have No Female Conductors. Is Change Coming?" So again, yeah, you're right. Where's my problematic title alert? So I know a lot of people, and I know there are a lot of women who don't see a problem with saying female musician, female conductor. That's weird for me, because we don't say male conductor.
No,
we don't say male rapper,
violinist.
So I think the writer of this is not a woman. So there's a conversation there as well. Yep. There's a whole room of editors and all sorts of folks, maybe a diverse showing up there at the New York Times that saw that title and didn't say anything. So I before we even get into it, I have to critique that thing, that one issue. Secondly, top orchestras. What does that mean?
What do you say? Right.
What do you mean by top orchestras? There are so many systems, problematic systems, that are being maintained in language that we don't think anything about. We think it's splitting hairs to address it, but I don't think it is. In the same way that the conversation of calling grown women girls, like "hey girl" or whatever, has evolved in the way that I learned, back in the late '80s. I feel like there are so many more of those conversations and realizations we need to come to, and two of them are right there in the title of the article.
Well, Maren Alsop is the conductor that's highlighted, and talking about her recent departure from Baltimore. So one can assume what level of orchestra they're talking about by framing it that way. They're probably talking about a big city orchestra, right?
I didn't know Baltimore counted as one of those top orchestras, but
you don't think?
No shade, but no shade.
I'm talking large cities.
Large
cities.
Well, the orchestra that they repeatedly say is the top orchestra is which one? Do you know what is arguably, I won't, how can I say this? The orchestra that most people in the Western classical music field would consider the top orchestra is what?
In the United States.
Yeah. Is
New
what?
York Philharmonic.
No. And that's my point. The Cleveland Orchestra.
Really? I would have said second. I would have said Chicago.
Yep. No. It's definitely the Cleveland Orchestra. And Cleveland, Ohio isn't the largest city or nothing. They're just, the orchestra that maintains the respectability of classical music the best with their all-white seasons.
Hey, well, how about over there in Buffalo? Is Buffalo a small city? Because we've got Joanne Falletta there just for 20 years?
Yeah, no, that's a big deal. But are they... But look, but before we get too far off the point I'm trying to make, you understand what I'm saying is that we have to critique every little thing, female conductor, that phrase, but also top orchestra.
I get you.
Because we don't think of Buffalo when we think of top orchestras as we've problematically, thought of that phrase in the past. I think it's when people say the Big Five, they're talking about Cleveland, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, not necessarily in that order, but that all of that has to go. excuse me, if we're gonna move forward, and I
Right,
just want to
right.
make sure that we're naming that before we even get into this. Okay, let me read a little bit of this. It says, for years they have worked their way to the top of the classical music industry. They have confronted stereotypes that are too weak to lead. They have shared advice about how to deal with sexist comments and even how to dress. Now, a group of women could be on the cusp of breaking barriers in one of music's most stubbornly homogenous spheres, the male dominated world of orchestral conducting. You already mentioned that Marin Alsop is named in here. I think they might give a shout out to Joanne Falletta, but the woman that I wanted to highlight from this article is Jerry Lynn Johnson. So Jerry Lynn Johnson is a black woman. She's based in Philadelphia and is the conductor of the Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra. And, you know, it just highlights again the fact that you can't really use that phrase top orchestra in the way that we're used to using it, because that's shitting on the work that Jerry Lynn Johnson is doing with those incredible musicians in that orchestra that folks may not have necessarily heard of and wouldn't consider a top orchestra, but it's very important, a vital part of the East Coast and the whole, you know, nation when it comes to orchestras and the conversation of women leaders. Anyway, Jerry Lynn Johnson is quoted here saying, female leadership is more necessary now than it ever was. We need to allow the insight and perspective of someone who has been kept out of the halls of power to create more inroads for other people. And I wanted to make sure that I got that quote out from her, because she's doing some really incredible work. And when she's talking about allowing insight and perspective of someone who has been kept out, you know, knowing me, I have to dig into the intersections of this conversation. You know, is she talking about just women in that space, or is she talking about more? Is she talking about the fact that it's even harder for black women, as has been proven over the years? You know, I think, you know, her words make me think about the fact that it has to be more than just the representation, more than just being in the space. You know, we need these women who are rising the ranks, and rightfully so, to not fall into the same trap that these men have fallen into, which is maintaining the status quo. We need the white women conductors to fight for racial equity for other women of color in those spaces. You know, we need women conductors to do something different programming wise. You know, it's not benefiting anyone for us to, you know, have this renewed ecosystem and still be listening to Beethoven and still be listening to Brahms, or at least centering that. So as we move forward and really trying to critique the podium, because it's not a problem for me to critique the podium, but even as we start to get women into those positions, we need to make sure we're centering the words and the perspectives of folks like Jerry Lynn Johnson, Kalina Bovell, who we celebrate a lot on this podcast, and all of the other women of color out there really pushing for something different. There's always a little dust in the corners, as my teacher says, and as I say all the time. And I hope that we can keep that conversation going as we're talking about more women in leadership positions in orchestras.
I'd like to give a shout out to Sabrina Maria Alfonso. I've interviewed her a couple times. She's the founder and conductor and music director, chief cook and bottle washer with the South Florida Symphony Orchestra. So she's been that's a mobile orchestra too.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you're looking at somebody with leadership skills and keeping a band together, some folks like Sabrina should get a shot at a bigger podium, right?
Yeah. The article. Let me see if I can find this.
I didn't mean to
because
drag
it
this
was
out longer than you wanted to.
No. It was let me see. Let me search Naze. Here we go. I'm gonna read here, and this is still talking about Jerry Lynn Johnson. It says, Johnson, who is black, says she felt ensembles seem more willing to take chances on young men than young women. While the average age of music directors skews older, American orchestras have shown a willingness to hire charismatic young men, such as Gustavo Dudamel, who was named to lead the Los Angeles Philharmonic in 2007 when he was 26. Yannick Nézet-Séguin was 35 when he was hired by the Philadelphia Orchestra in 2010. Okay, what did I say Jerry Lynn Johnson does? She's the conductor of the Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra in Philadelphia. That group was founded in 2008. So you mean to tell me that Jerry Lynn Johnson didn't put forward any paperwork, didn't apply at all for the Philadelphia Orchestra position, or were they just more interested in having a man on the podium? Okay, and I don't know the inside. Maybe Jerry Lynn Johnson did not apply, but I find it hard to believe that the Philadelphia Orchestra, in the global search that they did for a music director, didn't know about the black woman conductor in their very town. So again, we have to name these things,
Sure,
and have to point these things out, and we have to continue to inspire our women conductors, especially our white women conductors, to always think about the intersectional issues that are there, and to remember that there are black women out here who are being completely looked over and not even considered, even with the rise of more women conductors in the field. There's always a little dust in the corner, and I hope that we will continue to be brave enough to critique all of these things as we move forward. Because at the end of the day, like I said, what work is being done if these women are being put into these positions of power, and the boards, the predominantly male boards, are trying to maintain the programming that will bring in the same old dollars? We have to talk about that.
Marin said something similar on her way out. She said, I told him you got to get out of that tower.
And she couldn't push it over.
Yeah.
She couldn't push it over.
Yeah.
So, hats off to Marin Alsop, one of the many women, pushing and trying. When I see somebody in one of these positions and it's the same old thing, the representation of it all goes away for me, because I don't see someone who's really pushing that status quo. And, is it the job of musicians or folks in these positions to do that? I think that's a conversation. We sort of talked about that last week with the New York Times article on Jesse Montgomery, and the way that Jesse was saying that I'm just here to be a composer. I'm not always trying to be a social justice warrior, and I get all of that, but there's too much work to be done for folks in positions of power, alleged positions of power anyway, to do nothing. And I have to start looking at anybody funny who's in those positions maintaining the status quo. So again, I know it sounds like double talk for me a lot, but shout out to the women conductors, and you have work to do. You have a job to do.
Yeah, someone wrote in to me about that too, that we didn't give enough respect to Jesse. And I had to write back and say, we both love Jesse. You got to go back and listen. But what we do on this podcast is look at the other implications and the other ways that these stories are read and understood.
That's 2 emails that didn't make it to me. I guess y'all know what y'all get when y'all send me the messages, but
people write to me.
No, I think that's great. So I guess they're saying that you need to put some respect on Jesse's name.
And I wrote back to the guy. I know who the guy is.
Okay.
I know who it is. But anyway. I wrote back to him and I said, listen to it again. We both said that we love Jesse's music. We look at things differently. And I also provided him a link to This American Life, because if you don't want somebody looking at the undercurrents in some of these articles, then maybe you want something nice and easy to digest. So.
Yeah. Anyway, like I said, shout out to all of the women conductors. I'm rooting for y'all. I'm rooting for y'all to make change. Another one of the, as we transition out of this, we have one more accidental to get to real quick. But as we transition out of this, I wanted to give a special moment to another one of the women conductors who's featured in the New York Times article. Her name is Susanna Malki. I had the pleasure of performing under her baton in Detroit. I definitely remember that there was a Thomas Addis violin concerto on the program, and Thomas Addis is new music, so-called crunchy music, so that definitely took some time and some attention out of the folks in the orchestra. I wish I could remember. I almost want to say that Pictures at an Exhibition was on the program. But anyway, really incredible conductor, one of the only conductors that I think back in my memory and all of my time in orchestras and think about favorably. There's Susanna Malki. Yeah. I've performed under May Ann Chin a few times, and she always brings some really incredible stuff to the podium. But I wanted to highlight a performance led by Susanna Malki. This is a piece of music called Circle Map. It's by a woman composer named Kaija Saariaho. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Kaija Saariaho. It's called Circle Map, composition from the year 2012. Really exciting composition that I've enjoyed listening to a little bit of. So here's the last little bit of it as performed by the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra. Circle Map by Kaija Saariaho. So again, when I'm talking about doing something different and pushing for change, the receipts are already going to be there for a lot of these women conductors, maybe even most of them. I already talked about the Thomas Addis that she led, Susanna Malki in Detroit. We're hearing this piece of music by Kaija Saariaho. So there's that general aesthetic that, it's obvious to me that this is a conductor who is interested in the next step, interested in moving the genre and the practice of orchestral rehearsal and orchestral performance to a new level. And I think it's exciting to think about. We need to make sure that this is remaining a part of the conversation as well as representation. It has to all mix into one. I'm thinking right now of Opus with the Women's Philharmonic.
Yeah.
There are recordings that orchestra made specifically of the music of Florence Price that it's almost impossible to find anywhere else. I'm thinking of pieces of music like The Oak by Florence Price or her Mississippi River Suite. These are pieces of music that we probably wouldn't know if it weren't for the Women's Philharmonic. And we especially wouldn't know it if those groups were playing Brahms and Beethoven. So
sure.
Again, just rehashing the point that it's more than the representation. It's the work that you have to do when you become the representation. So huge shout out to Susanna Malki and all of the women out there changing the game in classical music. The last sentence of that article I meant to say, let me scroll down here really quick. It says, there are some really amazing women out there. I look at it and I think, wow, it's 2021. What are we waiting for? Well, what are we waiting for is some of these men to step out of the way, to step off the podium. And that's just that. Okay. Anyway, final accidental. We're going over to slip discs. So you are.
I don't even know why you already know. I don't know why you give this guy air.
I'm gonna give it a flat as well. I'm gonna give a shout out to Caesar. Caesar sent me this, and I think it's very interesting. We're gonna take a look. It says English orchestra sacks half its players to become more diverse. Well, first and foremost, it sounds like you're doing the right thing.
in quotes, more diverse.
Right.
There's got to be a dig.
Yeah. All right. Let's read here a little bit what Norman Lebrecht's talking about. He said, "We understand that English."
He didn't write anything. He wrote 3 lines and then pasted a letter in there.
Okay, okay, so let's read his 3 lines. It says, "We understand that English touring opera has sacked half of its players in a bid to replace them with, quote, diverse musicians as required by Arts Council England. The dismissal came out of the blue. Here's what the freelance players were told on Friday by the company's boss." So like you said, he posts the letter here, and let me just read a little bit of it. It says, "I know that all those players have achieved distinction in their work with other groups," talking about these diverse musicians, "in their teaching and in other fields. I recognize, too, that this last 18 months has been extremely difficult for freelance artists and technicians. I know that you are not likely to read gratitude into this message, but I assure you that I do feel grateful for what you have brought to ETO, English Traveling Orchestra Opera, in the seasons during which you have played so far." So that comes from their music director, allegedly a letter that was sent out by the group to these musicians. First and foremost, we're talking about freelance contracts. We aren't talking about employment positions. We're talking about an orchestra that, operated without having to provide, as far as we know, full-time employment, health insurance, other benefits. They scoot under that radar by offering these freelance contracts year after year that these musicians, accept year after year. And I get it, how it is out here as a musician. And that's what they need to be mad at. Not at the fact that those contracts have stopped for the sake of diversity. That's the first thing I think on that. But, secondly, it's the Arts Council of England who is also just sort of staying out of it. There is actually an update to this article that was published today, basically with a statement from the Arts Council of England, which, is sort of the larger organization over the English Traveling Opera, maybe like the big union organization or whatever over there, basically saying, look, we didn't tell them to send out this letter. We're staying out of it. And I think that's very telling as well. What would it look like for the Arts Council of England to actually take a stand and say, yes, this is something that we need to do, or this is something that we disagree with, but X, Y, and Z, sort of that so-called neutral place isn't actually neutral. So I think, that's something as well. But,
that's a stance.
Yeah,
saying you don't have a stance is a stance.
Is a stance, yeah. And, again, like I said, they need to be mad at the generations of systemic racism. It's so easy for, and I was thinking of, we were talking about this with the Big Brother issue as well. How quickly do we forget about not the years or decades, but the generations of inequities, especially in this field? We forget about all of that when one thing is done to try to fix that, because none of these issues can be fixed overnight. But we do one thing, they do one thing to try to fix that, and all of a sudden they're the bad guys. They're the racists. Woke culture is taken over.
Yeah.
And, of course, as is true with all of these slip disc articles, the comment section is something else.
Yeah.
I'm not even going into that comment section, but anyway, any ideas or any thoughts? If you had to, I know it's sort of hyperbolic, but I'm gonna ask anyway. This is called TRILLOQUY. I almost don't want to ask, but I will. You get the pink slip because it's time for them to diversify. What are you gonna say? What are you gonna do?
Well, damn. I guess I'm gonna go out and look for a job.
I don't think that's gonna happen. Certainly not where you work. But again, we're not talking about people getting fired for the sake of diversity. Where this article, that letter makes it clear that they're just not being rehired and renewed. And if you have a problem with that, that means there's some protections that you need to be fighting for your job, instead of blaming this on a position that was never yours.
Couldn't they just have easily have lost the position to somebody who's a better player?
Yes, they could have, but they don't think about that. They don't think about that at all.
What if they're a better player and black?
Ooh.
Ooh.
Anyway, dark shout out as usual to Norman Lebrecht. I think all of this is funny. I'll have the links in the description. Hey, if you feel a way about this, if you would feel slighted if your freelance contract didn't get renewed because all of y'all up in there are white and none of y'all have done anything to fight for diversity in those spaces, but now you mad because somebody else wants to diversify. How much work of diversifying the space did you do for all of those years getting this freelance contract? That's my question for them. That's my question for them. So I don't want to hear it. Anyway, to transition us out of this first movement into the second movement, we're going to hear from a soprano of color. Her name is Sumi Jo, and she is performing one of my favorite tunes from all of opera in Strauss's Die Fledermaus. There's first of all, it's an opera all about champagne. People are drinking champagne and getting in trouble, and the chambermaid dressing up as somebody else. Anyway, you know how romantic operas can be, all whimsical. Anyway, at one point in the opera, there's a character who comes to the party and she sings the laughing song. And I'm laughing at all these people mad at diversifying efforts. And again, like I said, reality TV and the pageants and these orchestras in the NFL. Y'all are so funny. So we're going to listen to a little bit of Strauss's laughing song from Deflator Mouse to get us into the second movement. Love that piece of music. And listen, now tell the truth, Scott. This is called TRILLOQUY. When I was looking for recordings of the laughing song to share today, this was not the first or second or third recording that I came on. Why? Why did I end up selecting this one? Do you remember?
You were looking for something with a little bit more depth, some richness. Richness.
Oh, okay. So every time that we're talking about, oh, well, you're just doing this or choosing that or whatever because they're black or they're a person of color. Well, maybe the recording is better. Maybe their musicianship, maybe the folks who that opera orchestra over there gave the contracts to are actually qualified to be in the space. See, people forget that when you hire diverse and when you make these equitable decisions, it's not like you're just throwing anybody into the ring. These people are qualified. These people can play this music and they deserve to be there. And quite honestly, they deserve to be there more than you, because I believe that the article and the letter that those musicians got said half the orchestra was sacked. So sorry that you weren't on the half that got to stay.
Damn. Chilly.
Ooh, goodness gracious. They are something else out here. All right. This is movement 2, where Scott and I share a piece of music that we have been repeating over and over and over all week. Just taking that repeat. And here on TRILLOQUY, we're going to take the second ending and talk a little bit about why we were repeating that music so much and why we loved it. Scott, how about you get us started this week in the second movement? What you got?
I've been letting the algorithm pick for the last couple of days because I've been trying to get a bunch of shit that I should have thrown away when I moved into the house 15 years ago.
You're doing a little fall cleaning, or late summer cleaning.
Yeah, and I'm trying to get rid of stuff. And so the algorithm just sort of took over. And I found myself down a jazz listening rabbit trail for a while. And Courtney Bryan's recordings started to come across.
Yeah, member of the TRILLOQUY family.
Opus 91, if you want to go back and listen to her. But then it tripped on over into some of the stuff that she wrote for orchestra and voice. Part of the way that her vocal, I didn't get the vocalist's name from the YouTube recording, but I felt her jazz aesthetic working into the classical realm as well. And this was something that, again, we talk about the idea of being challenged. A lot of her approach here is new to me. And part of it I'm excited about. And part of it I feel like I have to go back and listen to and give it maybe fresher ears or give it more attention. So what I'm saying is that there are definitely moments in here that really interest me and grab my attention, and there's others that I feel like I have to go back and go, okay, wait, what is she trying to tell me here?
Let's take a listen. This is a little bit of Yet Unheard by Courtney Bryan.
What did he see?
That's Helga Davis, by the way. That's the name of that soprano singing there in the voice and from the perspective of Sandra Bland. I don't think you mentioned that. So, we have a poem that tells that story being performed in front of this orchestra by a black woman, music written by a black woman. And, again, I think we just have a recentering of the issues and the conversations we need to be having. When we talk about police brutality, we tend to center black men who are, in fact, we are disproportionately dealt with by the police. That does not mean that black women do not fall victim as well. I don't know if enough people have said it or are in on this part of the conversation, but that mugshot we have of Sandra Bland, they say that she was dead when that photo was taken.
Oh my God, I hadn't heard that.
They laid her on the floor and opened her eyes and took a picture to make it seem like that she was actually booked when she came in. So, there are so many fishy things about that story, and pieces of music like this help remind us of the things that were missed or the things that didn't come out. It's interesting how conversations around police brutality have changed based on what we happen to learn from the whole George Floyd murder. The fact that we probably would have never known about the way he died if it wasn't on tape.
Yeah.
The fact that we know based on the trial that the reporting from the police from the police was different and didn't even mention what had happened out there in front of Cup Foods. The power that people have to really spread information and to get the truth out there. And that plays a major role in not only the way that police officer was dealt with, but in the broader conversation. So I hope that everyone will go check out this piece of music, Yet Unheard, by Courtney Bryan, because not only is it an incredible piece of music, a poignant piece of music, but a piece of music that we need so that we can remember the untruths that surround that story. Keep the names alive, keep the names heard. Say her name, Sandra Bland. So yeah, thank you, Scott, for bringing that in, and thank you, Courtney Bryan, for writing that, and really incredible piece of music. I'll link this YouTube performance we're looking at in the description.
Dust to Dust is interesting as well. And also just let YouTube take you on a little trip through her jazz stuff. It's good fun.
Yeah, Generation Y, I think, is the piece of music that we featured last time. And I actually put that piece of music into the mix down in St. Louis. I didn't mention I've been virtually guest hosting their morning show, and Generation Y by Courtney Bryan made it through the playlist that I put together for them. So be sure to check out all of that stuff. All right, well, I'm turning to one. I spent 20-30 minutes railing on the white men conductors. Well, here I am finna celebrate one. So okay, but this is what happened. So over the weekend, I was catching up on the Spike Lee documentary that everyone has been talking about, 9/11 to 2021 and a half, I think is what it's called. But he's really centering New York, Spike Lee, and all of the folks who sort of contribute to the spirit of New York as it relates to the story of 9/11. So as he's going through this documentary, toward the end, I think of part 3 of the documentary, I'm hearing this music that sounds really familiar to me that I really like, but I can't quite remember what it is. And Spike Lee, in his genius, after it's done, just flashes the name of the piece and the composer, as all of the creators should. And I was reminded that it was a suite by Leonard Bernstein called On the Waterfront. I did do a little refreshing reading about it. Was a true crime film that he wrote the score for and all that sort of thing. I think that's great, but I think what I really hear in the composition from Leonard Bernstein is an understanding of different communities and the different aesthetics connected to those different communities. So if we listen to the opening here, there's a horn solo, and it reminds me very much of the spirit of the spiritual. Let's take a little listen. maybe he didn't have the spiritual in mind when he wrote those opening bars. But do you hear kind of what I mean?
Yeah.
I think about the way that Florence Price's First Symphony starts with that bassoon solo, or the English horn solo that the Afro-American Symphony, the William Grant Still, starts with. I can name many others. There's a horn solo at the beginning of William Levy Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony. So so understanding that corner of the repertoire and understanding Leonard Bernstein's relationship with communities of color, specifically Black folks, I can't help but to hear that in there and only imagine that that's a thing. But the other part of this piece of music, one of the other parts of this piece of music that really excites me is the active nature, and again, that so-called crunchy sound, that contemporary sound that Leonard Bernstein put into this piece of music decades ago that, inspired Spike Lee to include the music as a way of speaking to the chaotic havoc of 9/11 in New York and everything that was going on there. But just incredible music. Here's a little bit more of Bernstein's On the Waterfront Suite. If in a world full of performances of symphonic dances from West Side Story, Candide Overture, all of that stuff, you almost think that old Lenny Bernstein didn't have it in him, that sort of stuff. But that would get me on the front of my seat if I'm in the car listening to the radio, or God forbid in the concert hall hearing that. I would be completely excited. And I think that there are so many more people who can be excited about orchestral music if they have the through line that Spike Lee created. He's centering New York, specifically folks from Brooklyn, of which, Leonard Bernstein is one, going through the entire catalog of his music and finding the sounds that can really connect with a moment in time, a historical moment that impacted all of us, or most of us who were alive at the time, and really just bridging that gap. I'm really excited to get to revisit this piece of music, to listen to it in the shower or when I'm or cleaning up or whatever. Despite the fact that this is by the prototypical white male conductor, it's really great music that can connect to, again, our real true lives. And it sounds a little different. It's not as friendly as Eine kleine Nachtmusik or Beethoven 5, and yet it's completely great. I hope that more people will go back and revisit the suite from On the Waterfront by Leonard Bernstein. Did you and again, thinking about the fact that Spike Lee included this in his 9/11 documentary, and that's the reason why I remembered it, and the reason why probably a million people will now know a new piece of music. Did you have any takeaways from that documentary? Were there moments that hit you particularly hard, or things that you didn't know about that you learned from the documentary?
The water evacuation.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I had no idea.
Oh, and okay, and here I am just overlooking the obvious. That's why On the Waterfront must have been included. Yeah,
That
like
was
800,000 people were evacuated by the water taxi.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the number, but it was a lot, and I never heard about it until that documentary.
Yeah.
But, you talk about finding this ideal piece of music. Obviously, Spike had, some producers that knew their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So shout out to them. And also you have to admire the way Spike tells a story, because there were so many times where things would start off with levity and laughter and
Sure.
Upbeat. And then all of a sudden you realize that you might have a little bit of tear or a knot in your throat hearing somebody tell a story.
Yeah.
And you go, wait a minute, how did we get here?
Yeah.
He really, really paints a landscape with the way that he does interviews.
And it's so interesting because I think Spike Lee is good at bringing the lightness out of the conversation out of many people.
Yeah.
But if you go back, every one of the interviews that involve somebody Black, they're laughing half the time. And this is a documentary about 9/11, but
He did a lot of screaming too.
there's still that rapport. And,
Yeah.
and you talk about Spike Lee's team of producers, and I'm sure they're out there. But I also have to name that Leonard Bernstein was embedded in the community. He's someone who folks know. I remember years ago watching The View, and Whoopi Goldberg talked about some of her earliest memories. Her mom would take her to the park and Leonard Bernstein would be conducting. So he isn't someone, from my perspective, who was just sitting up in this ivory tower, conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He was down on the ground, and he was dealing with people of color, black folks, queer folks, and really trying to make the world a better place. As often as I can, I remind people that Leonard Bernstein was there when the Stars came out down in Alabama, the rallies for voting rights. Nina Simone famously performed. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was there giving speeches, but Leonard Bernstein was there as well, and I haven't been able to find any footage of him speaking. The images are there, but anyway, someone who I really think that we have to name and think about in a more dynamic way than we currently do. I think to some extent, a little bit, we're getting away from symphonic dances from West Side Story and Candide and digging into more of his stuff. Leonard Bernstein has symphonies,
Sure.
and all sorts of stuff, but also the work he did away from the podium is very important to note. And for all of these people complaining about contracts not being renewed, if you were doing the work that Leonard Bernstein was doing, maybe you would have been on the half of the orchestra that gets to stay. All right.
Whoops.
So that's I can't get over that fact just quite yet. So again,
Okay.
when we're talking about white men in positions of power and white men who feel like, oh, don't even apply, the woke gang is taking over and they don't want us in those spaces. Well, look back to folks like Leonard Bernstein who did the work and who somebody like Spike Lee feels comfortable platforming, because you have to admit Spike Lee's not going to have anybody's music on his
Right.
stuff,
Right.
especially considering his history in these conversations. So
Yeah.
shout out to
Terrence Blanchard wrote the original music for it. So.
yeah, all of the original music. So yeah, shout out to Spike Lee. I definitely suggest that documentary. I'll have a link. It's on HBO, I think, but I'll
Yeah.
put some information in the description of this. And shout out to the late great Leonard Bernstein. Go check out the On the Waterfront suite that he wrote. All right, well, we're getting up on the third movement here. Today's guest, we have a returning guest. Katy Henriksen was featured way back in Opus 9, I believe, one of the baby opuses of TRILLOQUY, and she comes back to talk about her work as a concert promoter, as a podcaster, and everything in between. Katy, for folks who weren't here, I'm guessing a lot of people weren't here way back then, but she was actually working in public radio when we had our interview, when we had our conversation. We actually recorded the interview, Scott, over ISDN. So kind of old school for folks who know what that sort of technology is. But since her last interview, she's moved on into an independent role, has her own 501c3, and all sorts of stuff that we talk about in our interview. Where we start is talking about Katy's work as a concert promoter and putting together concerts to platform new music artists, breaking down the status quo of classical music by booking performances from artists who do the same thing. But, the issue of COVID and what does all of that mean in these days when we're talking about going to concerts and planning concerts. So that's where we start our conversation. To get into the conversation, I'm going to feature the music of one of the artists that was actually featured on her podcast, Sound Off. This artist is called Kasim Nakvi, and they actually have a piece of music called Brutal Moderna. How perfect is that? Where we start our conversation. So here's Brutal Moderna by Kasim Nakvi, and here's my conversation with Katy Henriksen.
it's huge for me. I'm taking everything very seriously. I actually wrote an editorial in I Care If You Listen last winter, and it seems to be the same, that it resonates just as much right now. So the whole premise was talking about how people who are creating classical music, or this really pertains to any art, really, it's like we're not seen as valuable unless we're of privilege, because we're not supposed to create unless we have a lot of money, right? And so it's like all of these artists I know who made Spotify's around, artists, performers aren't making any money from recordings at all. So they've been told to tour. And here it is, we're for this last year and a half and now more, they've been told not to tour, but now tours are back. So where do you draw that line? Where do you come up with something where you're still supporting touring musicians and artists and cultivating a community through live music, but doing it responsibly and safely? So basically what I've come up with is, we have here where I am, there's this amazing like 1920 parking garage in downtown Fayetteville. And it's a garage, so it's open air, but it's also covered. So if it rains or storms or whatever, we've got it all covered, and we can produce these really awesome socially distanced concerts. And also the residence is amazing. It's like just really open, wide residences. So that's really kind of what I'm doing. I have Tatsuya Nakatani, who's an experimental percussionist, coming through in September. And then I have a duo called Sky Creature, and that's vocalist Majel Connery, who also does synths. And she is someone I connected with actually last winter. She was the vocalist in this group Oracle Hysterical, who you may know. They do all this cool stuff where they have like a mixture of like Baroque instruments with like electric guitar and bass, and Majel singing. She does like she mixes opera in with like post-punk and all this other stuff. So I'm really excited, and I kind of was like, I really want to be able to host this type of experience, but I also want to do it safely. So that's kind of what I'm doing. It's really tricky though.
There are a number of artists who have, and again, just even outside of Western classical, who have said, okay, at all of my shows, you have to have been vaccinated and show a negative test or whatever to get in. And it seems like depending upon the genre or the type of music, that conversation is engaged differently. Maybe at a country show, folks are pissed, or maybe at a hip hop show, that's not, something that folks are happy to see. Do you think the spaces in which we exist are more willing to go along with those guidelines? Is the culture of vaccine status that we've seen unfold play a relationship with new music audiences, classical music audiences, and everything in between?
Well, I mean, I kind of feel this goes back to this idea of privilege too. I mean, I think that there's so many levels of privileges that come with being able to like safely produce a small, like, for example, I can do small scale concerts, whereas like some other touring acts, they like need to have these big, huge concerts in order for it to make sense. So that's something where Trillium is really able to do things differently. And and also just the socially distance, and then like that kind of, for me, I guess I'm kind of long-windedly going around the question here.
No worries.
So for me, Trillium is like, the whole premise of what I was doing was all about small scale. And so I think there's an opportunity. I mean, even when the pandemic hit, I kind of saw that putting together concerts in non-traditional, not concert hall settings, and reconfiguring the boundary between audience and performer was the whole idea. So I saw that this opportunity, especially if you're doing a safe outdoor distant show, it kind of translates very easily for Trillium, where maybe if you're doing a black box concert hall show, it's a lot trickier. You're indoors, you've got the seated rows and all that kind of stuff. But back to your question, I do feel like audiences that are contemporary classical-ish leaning tend to be people who say, yes, we should get the vaccine and we're going to go along. But, you know, it's across divides. I know that people are talking about like that it's all like because of Trump or whatever, but it's actually, I actually know people who are like on the far other side of the spectrum who are also like not wanting to mask and not wanting to vaccinate. So it's like, I don't know. I can't wrap my head around it at this point. So
yeah, well, I mean, for all of the ways that the world has changed in this past year, maybe even the past couple years, I think back to your being on, you know, for all intents and purposes, on the ground floor of TRILLOQUY. You were featured way back in Opus 9. And, you know, something that I have been dying to ask since then pertains to the career shift that you saw shortly after your feature. You know, when you were on TRILLOQUY last, you were, you know, in public radio, local radio, doing that whole thing, and now that's not the case. So I wonder if I can ask what happened after your last TRILLOQUY feature. Why did you decide to jump ship when it comes to public radio?
yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into play there, but I have been in public radio for 8 years. And I am based in Arkansas. I know that we talked about how I was in Arkansas and I needed to be here. I'm raising a daughter here and my family's all here. So it was kind of like one of those things where I'm really based in Northwest Arkansas. I couldn't like look at different possibilities and like moving to a larger market, say, or whatnot, that are kind of traditional career trajectories. If you're wanting to like stay in the public radio and kind of continue pushing your career forward. There was a station manager change, and also just at my station, very much a push towards news formats, because the station was a mixed format. So we had music and news, but they were shifting more and more towards news. They shifted my programming to the evening when it used to be in the daytime, and just weren't giving any resources. And I was like, I think this is a sign. This is like a chance for me to really change things up. So I took the plunge, became self-employed, and I'm doing lots and lots of different things. I don't even know where to start with that. I did start doing right after I left the station. I did publicity for New Amsterdam Records, and that was like an amazing opportunity. And it's a record label I've loved for a long time, and I knew about them because I program New Amsterdam releases on my show all the time, and I've interviewed artists and things like that. So I had the opportunity to kind of really go deep with the music PR side of things. So that's what I'm doing now. I do music PR through Riot Act Media. And then I really took this idea of figuring out a way to make my podcast a national, international podcast instead of something that's just for the local airwaves. So I do this podcast Sound Off now. And actually the first season did have a number of New Amsterdam artists, which was kind of random because I started the podcast before I left KUAF, before I was even working with New Amsterdam. But then I didn't produce it and actually launch the season until after I was already with New Amsterdam. So Caroline Shaw is a guest, Nellie Joachim's a guest, Anthony McGill's a guest, Shara Nova, My Brightest Diamond, she was a guest, all sorts of people. And then I've got my second season that's coming up that I'm producing, and it's got Aruf Afjab. Let's see, gosh, I'm blanking out. I've got so many, Kaki King. Let's see. I'm blanking out. Of course,
all sorts of great people.
Contemporary, classical, and hybridity. I really like. So I saw the limitation. Like when I talked to you about doing classical radio in Arkansas, there were advantages, and that it was a smaller market, and there was like the station manager was not. He kind of let me do my own thing. So it wasn't as rigid as like a larger market that was like already kind of like, we know our classical audiences and we know what they listen to. My station manager kind of let me kind of play loose with the boundaries. And so then Sound Off is just like kind of a continuation of that. It's even more loose, and it's not even necessarily classical. The premise is hybrid sounds. So music that challenges the status quo, like music that just for whatever reason is challenging what our norms are, what the canon is, all these kinds of things. Because I've my background's in gender and music, and I've
Yeah.
always loved like so many different types of music. So I think for me, even when I was in classical music as a host, I was always trying to widen the range of what that meant. Because I mean, I love all kinds of music, as I know you do. And I know that
Yeah.
you've probably gotten the like, well, what you're, I remember one time I was at a roots music festival, and I said I was a classical host. What are you doing at a roots music festival?
Yeah.
It's like, really? You don't put us in silos like that, you know?
Right. And we're definitely going to get into sound off, but before we leave the subject of radio in particular, something that's been ringing in my head a few weeks ago, one of my favorite podcasters said, and this is more hip hop based, this podcast, but he basically said, I hadn't heard anyone actually say the word radio in 10 years. We talk about popular radio shows that, are also offered on digital platforms, on YouTube, and those sorts of things, but just the institution of radio as a thing seems to be fading behind some of the content that it platforms. Do you still consider, after all the time that you've spent away from the live microphone, do you still consider radio one of those means of creating this new ecosystem that we're working toward, challenging these status quos? Is radio still poised to be able to do that?
I mean, I think it is, but it's totally different from I mean, so we have the terrestrial radio signal, which is like, so I think there's still something to be said for like getting on those airwaves, because we have to think about all the people who don't even have access to internet through to stream these things. So like, I know my head is like, I'm very digital. I'm always like, I'm on all the platforms and I'm streaming. Streaming is just like second nature to me, but there's a lot of listeners who don't. I mean, my sister lives rurally in part of Arkansas, and she doesn't have the internet out where she lives. It's like, she still wants to listen to like a CD or turn on the radio to like actually hear music for her. So I think we're doing a disservice if we're thinking that everyone's online all the time and has access to everything, when that's not necessarily true. I also think it's so busy out there. So I do still consider myself radio, because I know sometimes when I say I do a podcast, it's like, what does that even mean?
Right.
I mean, a podcast is literally just like you put like a sound file online so that people can stream it. And that's basically what it is. So it can be anything. And so I try to explain that, like, I'm a longtime audio producer. So it's like, I'm putting together like an actual show. So sometimes I try to call my podcast a show instead of a podcast, just because of the perceptions and the things that people get in their heads.
Especially considering that at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone started a podcast. It was sort of like this boredom project instead of, a focused thing. And not to, speak down on the quarantine era podcasts, but I mean, I think we definitely saw an explosion in that regard. To a similar point, we've also really seen an explosion of the idea of challenging the status quo in classical music, Western classical music, however we want to call it. And, we both know that a lot of work has been put into that, before we were talking about race and gender in the way that we have been for the past couple years. What's your take on how that conversation, again, of challenging the status quo has evolved in light of world tragedy, in light of the pandemic? Do you think we're headed in the right direction generally?
I mean, I think there's like I think we are in general, although there's also still tons of performative actions that are taking place. And I think honestly, I think that people who are independent, like I've always been staunchly independent minded and thinking, but at the same time, it's like getting institutional support is a huge help financially to make things happen. But institutions are typically still so far behind, and also like to do those performative things to make themselves look good. So I think it's been really beneficial for me to be staunchly independent and like have my own podcast where I'm like actually the vision is all mine 100%. I can do whatever I want to. That being said, it's just so, the landscape is so noisy out there. So it's like we go back to like talking about platforms and streaming and how accessible everything is. It's just it's harder. I mean, like, it's so weird to me that I can like pick up my phone and look at someone else's internet experience or feeds. It's that they don't see any of the same things I do.
Right.
So I think that's what we're dealing with now. I'm really glad that we are seeing conversations in mainstream publications, or like symphonies are programming more diversely than they ever have before. But I don't know what that's going to look like 2 years down the road when this isn't a fad anymore. You know?
Exactly.
So
Exactly. And before we got on the line, I went and refreshed. I listened once again to the latest episode of Sound Off, the one featuring Caroline Shaw. And first I have to say I really appreciate how polished the show is. One thing about podcasts is that they run the gamut when it comes to people plugging in the microphones and just going for it. And some of the most popular and successful shows do have that feel, and then other very successful shows have the very polished and put together feel. I wonder what podcasting has taught you, or what perspectives you've gained from podcasting when it comes just to presenting, to content creation, maybe even to interviewing. Not everyone who does interview-based podcasts, not all of us have the journalism degrees or things. What skills have you sort of picked up along the way of creating your own content independently?
Gosh, I think really, for me, honestly, it goes back to a deep curiosity. So for me, it's all about a deep curiosity in whatever subject I have, whoever I'm talking to, the music, and having a compelling conversation. And then once I have that, it's about making that same compelling conversation happen, but like in a more produced sense, and weaving in that music. So another thing for me is like, I think I really wanted to weave the music in directly with the conversation. I didn't want it to be like, blah, blah, blah. Oh, now we're going to have some music. I just want it to be a natural progression. And I don't really know. I don't really know how I formulated that, because I did, when I launched my podcast, there was like an uphill battle, because, when I had my 2-hour format radio show, and you have to do certain ways of talking and things and delivery, it was like finding a whole new rhythm. So that was weird. I don't really know that I have any tips other than like, just kind of like, I'm going to go in and spend lots and lots of time really honing in on what the most integral parts of these conversations are, and then finding the most compelling pieces of music, putting them together. And I don't find myself as like, I'm not like one of those people who's like a super producer. Like I don't have 100 files open in the multi-track or anything like that. I mean, my studio is just a plug-in USB Rode mic, and that's pretty much it. And then I had a friend who had composed the intro, outro music, theme music, and then I picked out like the parts that felt right for putting that in there. And I don't know, I just kind of played around. I mean, I think that's a lot of it, right? It's like
trial
playing
by
around.
fire.
just try it, experiment, play around, do what feels right. And just, I don't know, it's a pretty intuitive process, if that makes sense for me.
That definitely makes sense. I appreciate it. Again, back to your conversation with Caroline Shaw, I appreciated your mentioning the collaboration with Kanye and even including some of that music. I know for a fact that that's something that most people who interview a woman like Caroline Shaw will not bring into the conversation, or will not bring into the project. To that, are there narratives or lines of questioning or conversation that you feel more comfortable engaging through your own work, as opposed to, live radio, or maybe even a podcast that you would produce in conjunction with a big organization?
Well, sure. I mean, like it goes back to what I said about working through an institution. There's certain barriers that you can't cross, really, I guess.
Hmm.
And being truly independent, it allows me to have more freedom to have maybe trickier conversations or touch on points that I wouldn't get to if I was on like a public radio station, you
Yeah.
know. Or sometimes I have a chance to be more adventuresome. And I also, one of my things is also, I think we can all end up getting too comfortable with our perspectives and where we come from. And we're like talking to an echo chamber
Right.
essentially. And that's always one of my guiding principles is to always push outside of that bubble and our boundaries and kind of challenging ourselves in the process. So that's kind of how I approach all my interviews and all my subjects. And I'm always thinking about that and being like, how can I push this further? And also, how can I like have people really like become really omnivorous with their listening and their thoughts, because I think there's so much we can all learn from deep listening, essentially, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think about that idea of the echo chamber a lot because it's so easy for us to create content that really showcases the sensibilities of folks that we agree with or are doing the same work. Have you thought much about what it means to challenge let you Anthony McGill is also in your roster, what it would mean to like challenge someone like that, someone so respected in classical music when it comes to breaking down the status quo. Is an on-air argument something that you're looking for, or is there a general vibe that you try to maintain when it comes to your collaborations?
yeah, I mean, I definitely not. I mean, I know there's all different types of interviewers. I'm not hesitant to like to start discussing things that might feel thorny, but at
Hmm.
the same time, I'm not one of those interviewers who's going to like just I want to be abrasive and I want to talk about let's get I'm more interested in having a conversation where I'm connecting with that person
Yeah.
somehow. But also challenging myself, challenging them, kind of getting everyone to like rethink all of their positions and be more open about everything, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll definitely have links to Sound Off and some of the other work you're doing. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit about Riot Art Media. Again, when we think about classical music and changing the status quo, we tend to center orchestras or other performing arts institutions, but other forms of media, journalism play a huge role in that, even if we don't see it as such. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work with Riot Art Media.
Oh, it's
Riot
Riot
Art
Act, Riot
I
Act,
can't read
Riot
my
Act.
own
It's
my
okay.
handwriting. Riot Act
Yeah.
Media.
Yeah, no, Riot Act Media is awesome. They're a independent music PR firm that actually has been around since probably, I don't know, like when they started. It's been like at least 15 years they've been
Hmm.
around. And I actually got to know them as a journalist. So I was a journalist who was covering artists that were represented through Riot Act Media. And then at some point now I'm actually a publicist through their firm. And it's really awesome. I think this touches on the fact that I was like raised in a classical music environment, but also with parents who like loved Joni Mitchell and Chicago and all these other like Beatles, what have you.
Yeah.
And then I went to school and I studied violin and voice and all these things, but I was always interested in like, I like love Nina Simone. And then I loved indie rock. I loved blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
So it depends, like some people would get to know me and they're like, oh, like when I was at the radio station doing a classical music program, some people saw me from my background as like mostly covering indie rock, basically. And they're like, what do you know about classical music? And then the people who knew me from growing up, like my grandfather was a classical music professor, blah, blah. And I grew up with like a harpsichord in my grandparents' living room and plucking on
Wow.
it. Yeah, it's crazy. And I would say plucking, and then I'm like, I realized you can't pluck a harpsichord. I was hammering on the keys.
Yeah.
But it just, I've always felt in between. I also grew up as a Suzuki student, and
Right.
I don't know, some Suzuki players have this experience, others don't, but it was like this in between where like, I mean, I didn't start traditionally classically. I was started Suzuki, so it's a very ear method training. You learn how to like really hear things in order to play them. I always felt in between. I wasn't really super theoretical about classical music and whatnot. And then I also loved I loved the Cranberries. I was like into the Cranberries when I was in college. Mazzy Star, all these awesome people. So I don't even. What was your question?
Well, yeah, sorry, no, just your work with Riot Act Media.
Oh,
So
yeah,
you're a publicist now with them
so
officially.
I mean, basically, it kind of all goes back to like mixing it all up, and I also feel like what I was going to say is that I've always felt kind of othered because I've never really completely fit in anywhere. I mean, I've never completely, like, I was a journalist, but that was like by night a lot of times when I was like in my 20s. And then I was at KUAF and I was a classical music person, but I was also like interviewing Kathleen Hanna of Bikini Kill. And I've always felt like really weirdly out of place no matter what, because I like to blur the boundaries. And I feel like that Riot Act is a great place for me because I can like actually do a lot of publicity with lots of artists who are challenging what I don't know. I'm going off now.
Oh no,
but
you're great. I mean, and you know, again, to Riot Act, one thing I really appreciated reading as I looked over that website was the sort of fan first approach, as they say. And when you describe yourself as someone who, you know, can never really fit into a specific box, I feel like many of us actually have that experience. You know, I can definitely speak to that. So when it comes to creating, media from a fan first perspective, it seems like the meshing of genre, the cross pollination has to be a part of it, considering how many people are not strictly roots, strictly classical, strictly hip hop, you know?
I mean, honestly, I don't think any of us really are. And that's when when I feel like I've been othered, I'm probably like, I mean, how most of us probably are othered all the time. And I feel like, especially in our current structure of like highly classified or like codified systems where you have to be this or labeled all the time. It's like, you know, that's what capitalism like basically you've probably like seen like how the label for genres, that was actually a marketing term that was come up with to like kind of get people like, we're going to go in the blues format, or you're going to be in jazz, or you're going to be in whatever. So I really love right now, I think that I'm seeing a breakdown of those walls a little bit. I feel like people are feeling more and more like they can like embrace all encompassing things. I mean, we're people, we're all like, we have multiplicities inside of us, you know, and we should embrace it. I think it's been hard to do that. I think it's more messy. I think that you can't define it as easily and you can't quantify it as easily. So it makes it harder to like go do a career, or like even like people want that one line to like say, well, what do you do? And it's like, well, I don't just do this one thing, you know? I mean, and so I love that we're getting to the point where it feels like it's more acceptable to be that way.
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time really thinking about that question when you meet someone new and they're like, well, how do you spend your days? What do you do for work? It's almost easier to just say, well, I'm unemployed, you know, and because, you know, they really want to, you know, it's really a conversation starter. I feel like more often than not. But no, I definitely feel you there when you use that word messy, you know, and I appreciate your highlighting the fact that it makes it more difficult to climb the professional ladder sometimes because there's so much stagnation. I'll use that phrase in the way that we look at media creation, especially in proximity to classical music. With all of that considered, and again, going back to the idea of changing status quos, who do you see as the opposition when you're creating your media or diving into this work? Are there types of institutions or types of individuals as you see on the other side of this front that we're pushing on?
I I don't really feel like I have enemies that I could name particularly.
And not necessarily
Um,
enemies, but you have to admit
the
that
pr-
so
well, you
many
have to have the
venues,
right.
just are in one lane and that's it.
Yeah. I feel like I, so the status quo. So I want to, what I'm really pushing against is quite simply that, and
Yeah.
like allowing us all to change our perceptions of the world, I guess. I mean, I definitely think I am pushing specifically against a lot of the systems that have kind of kept the status quo in play,
Hmm.
whether it's like museum institutions, academic institutions, media institutions, corporate media, all that landscape. I mean, I'm challenging all of those systems. I don't know, to take it a little bit localish for me. So, for example, in Northwest Arkansas, the Walmart headquarters is in Northwest Arkansas. So,
Hmm.
the Waltons, who are some of the richest people in the world, and it's the headquarters is right here. Well, Alice Walton has built an art museum called Crystal Bridges. And then she's also opened the Momentary, which is a contemporary wing of Crystal Bridges.
Hmm.
And so there's this museum culture that never existed in Northwest Arkansas. And there's lots of money to go around for the arts. But that gets very problematic when you're looking at a super rich family that's union busting, that's like pro charter schools, that's doing all this stuff. But at the same time, they're like, well, we're making Northwest Arkansas rich with culture. So I kind of see what I'm doing with my podcast and with my Trillium Salon series live concerts. I'm challenging the institutional kind of like our philanthropic way of how we basically everything has to be through philanthropy or university culture, or like I'm looking at creating something independently of that, because I think that's where we can actually truly challenge ideas, because I think it's like in the institutions it's stagnant. There's a lot of problems with philanthropy, which I don't need to get into.
Right.
Basically philanthropy keeps the control in the hands of rich elite people.
Hmm.
So
And we need more people to say that.
yeah. So I mean that's that's who I'm challenging, really. I
Sure,
guess.
sure. I really enjoyed hearing your contributions. I guess about a month ago now, a few weeks back, at the New Music Gathering conference, and as I went to different events and different performances there, I couldn't help but to think about how enriched I was feeling, especially by the different types of performances and the different types of conversations, but B, what it would look like if pockets of that could become more permanent things. I talk about the word divestment a lot when it comes to racial things. Black folks building our own things that are ours because the big institutions aren't listening. I wonder if we broaden that a bit and talk about new music communities. Is that a more viable way forward? Do you think there should be more energy spent in building new independent performing arts institutions and media organizations? Should the energy be going there instead of trying to fix the Met, trying to fix Juilliard and all these other traditional big monsters in the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially if we want to see changes now, I mean, it has to happen at the
Hmm.
grassroots level. I mean, that's where it'll all be. I like to look back at things like Black Mountain College that existed in the 1930s, and the flourishing of the arts that happened, and that was a truly independent thing too. I feel like the divestment and being truly independent is where the change really will happen, and where we can have actual agency and autonomy to do the things to make that growth happen. At the same time, we're existing in 21st century capitalism. It's
Yeah.
like I can talk about the institutions here at play in Northwest Arkansas. At the same time, I am part of that ecosystem, and I have to figure out how to work with that and grow. So I think you can get if you get too into like a purist approach where you're like completely like, I'm not participating and I'm not interacting with that at all, that can be problematic too, because then you end up siloing yourself off in essence, by not like expanding the conversation. So I think I look at ways to like dismantle these structures from the outside, but also as a way to help them maybe there's some people internally who can be like, I want to challenge this too. And so hopefully that leads to gradual change there as well. Yeah. But I think it starts with the grassroots and those of us who are on the ground, like doing independent thinking.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's hard to not want to completely burn the bridges and say, oh, let them rot. We're going to do our own thing. But I do think you make a very good point when it comes to, collaboration on all levels toward that change. And we need all different types of folks, I think, in the battle, people in the institutions, people completely outside of them, and everyone in between, just to make sure what we're working toward actually comes to fruition one day. But before I ask you my last question, how can folks check out Sound Off and learn more about you and all of the other work you're doing?
Sure. I have a website. It's not the most updated one, but you can get all my information there. So that's katyhenriksen.com, which is KatyHenriksen.com. And you'll be able to find my Instagram, my Twitter, and then you can also go to anywhere you listen to podcasts pretty much to find Sound Off with Katy Henriksen, which is my podcast. If you want to look at all the different links, I do the podlink.to/sound off, and then it gives you the Spotify link, the Castbox link, the Apple Music one, the blah, 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 all the ones, because we have to be in all the places now, right?
Yeah, you do. And there's a conversation there, these Spotify's and Apple Music, they have our content and are potentially benefiting from them in a way that's disproportionate to the way we benefit. And, that's why a lot of people have gone to the Patreon model. I think that's another conversation. But to put a bow on this one, I wanted to close with a little bit of music. When we talk about challenging the status quo, it's not just an act. It's not just work. There's actual art that, plays a role. So, to that, I wonder what you're listening to, what you could throw out to the audience as far as music or an artist that you feel like is challenging the status quo in the way that, you're working toward.
Sure. Okay.
And I hate because there's always 100 people to name, but,
right? I'm trying. Well, do you know Black Monument Ensemble?
I don't think I'm familiar. No, I would love to learn about Black Monument.
Black Monument Ensemble, and they put out actually a release. It's been out a while now, but Damon Locks runs the Black Monument Ensemble, and I love the textures that he's creating, and he's really kind of going between all these different worlds to collage sound. And he's in Chicago. And they made their last record in the height of last summer's pandemic during Black Lives Matter. And they did a lot of stuff outside. And so you could hear night bugs and all these different things and all the textures. I'm really into really cross genre stuff now. So yeah, check out Black Monument Ensemble. The new album is called Now. Damon is actually a guest in the second season of Sound Off, which I'm in production with. And so I hope that I can launch it soon. It kind of takes a back seat to the day-to-day of stuff where you have to get done right away.
Yeah.
You probably know what I'm talking about.
I definitely do. But we'll definitely hear a little bit of Black Monument Ensemble here. Katy, thank you so much for taking the time with me.
Thank you, Garrett. It's lovely to talk to you.
A little music there by the Black Monument Ensemble, a tune called Stay Beautiful. Scott, when we talk about flipping on its head the status quo of classical music and doing everything we can. We tend to do it from the, the social side of things, the conversational side of things. But that's not the only place where that work has to be done. Katy is just really incredible at finding the actual sounds that break down that status quo. I know this isn't music, this tune, Stay Beautiful by Black Monument Ensemble. I know that isn't music that a lot of the orchestral programmers, radio program directors are ready to put on at 10:30 a.m. on a Wednesday, but I think we're gonna have to get there eventually, especially considering how many types of artists there are creating this music that we believe should be considered as classical as everything else. It's not happening, again. So it's not all about the conversation pieces. It's also about the music itself and affirming the artists who deserve equal placement in those spaces. So yeah, shout out to Katy for all of the work she's doing there.
And that she's making it. It's good to hear that, she's making it outside of the jobby job and it's got her own 501.
More of us are. Is that giving you any ideas?
You ought to give everybody some ideas.
One thing I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I asked Katy was, is it beneficial to name the oppressor? When we're talking about changing the status quo, we talk about it from a spatial sort of abstract point of view so often. But at the end of the day, there are individuals, there are institutions holding up the status quo that we're all trying to change, that we're fighting against. We aren't holding back progress in our work. We're pushing forward, which means there are forces pushing against. Is it beneficial? Should it be, or can it be seen as progress to personify the problem instead of just speaking about it abstractly?
Yeah, because that's what gets the movement. If, in the article that you pointed out from the New York Times where Marin Alsop was mentioned and such, one guy was, I forget the gent's name, he said, people respond to pressure.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
Okay, do they, though? So the thing is that if you don't apply pressure to the people that can make some of these decisions, if you don't make it uncomfortable, then they're not going to get to the point where they realize that a change needs to happen. Hopefully you get some sort of an apology.
Yeah.
So it's a very early necessary step.
You said something that I love. You said, make them uncomfortable. We need more of that.
This is messy. It's messy work. It's going to get messier before it gets cleaner, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And it's a necessary early step to name and make them uncomfortable.
Carnegie Hall had a open call, sort of a town hall, a virtual town hall last week that I couldn't make because I was going from one keynote speech to another appearance I had last Friday. But, that was born from a Facebook thread. And it's so easy for these large institutions to sort of wave off social media or wave off what somebody is saying on Facebook. But as we've seen and as we've been talking about, the internet is a player, and these institutions that are not used to having to respond to the people, just to the masses, are having to, that time is running out. And I hope something good came out of that Carnegie Hall conversation, because they're around here putting up ads saying, oh, we're featuring the world's best violinists, and guess what all their violinists look like?
Joshua Bell.
Anyway, let's get into the into the Trilloquy. But yes, I feel like we have to get used and get comfortable with naming these institutions and naming these individuals that we're pressing against. So again, shout out to Katy and shout out to everyone trying to do this work. To get us into our final movement of the trill that I want to highlight, as I mentioned, I've been guest hosting down in St. Louis virtually. And one of the pieces that I included recently is called Blue Rondo a la Turk. It's by a group called Project Trio. The most and this is no shade, but the most famous, from my perspective, member of the group is the flute player who got all sorts of internet fame in the early days of YouTube by beatboxing on the flute. He has a beatboxing Mario video that has tens of millions of views. I had the pleasure of interviewing Project Trio when I was down in Knoxville. They performed with the Knoxville Symphony. So
is he he beatboxed over Peter and the Wolf, right?
Sure, yeah, did that as well.
That was fun.
Yeah, that one was good. So Greg Patillo, I believe his name is. So we get to hear him do a nice little trill at the end of this tune called Blue Rondo a la Turk as we get into the final movement.
Dave Brubeck tune.
Oh, you know that one, the Blue Rondo a la Turk.
Yep.
Yeah. Shout out to Greg Patillo, also Eric Stevenson and Peter Seymour, members of Project Trio. There's some really great music they're putting out there. All right, we're in the last movement. We are in the Trilloquy. And you know what, Scott? This week, my Trilloquy, my True and Real, isn't so inflammatory. It just, speaks to some of the moments that struck me this past weekend when we talk about the work we're doing and decolonizing classical music. So as I mentioned at the top of this opus, the American Composers Forum had its Racial Equity Summit where, we talked about some of the things that we've been doing, holding ourselves accountable, we went back a couple years ago to the goals we set and to how that looks today. And there were also just a series of panels. And the final panel was called What We Can Learn from Indigenous Communities. I believe that's the title of it. I'll have information there. But there was one of the panelists there was an indigenous artist. His name is Brent Michael Davids. And he started by talking about the way we need to change our vocabulary. Again, we were talking about that a little bit today, out of tune, false tuning and all that stuff. Well, he took it a step further and indicted the word music. He talked about how they don't really have in many indigenous languages a word for music, but rather words that speak to how the music happens. He said the closest word would be songing or musicking. And that was really interesting to me when we talk about music, when we talk about the way we create barriers around music, the way genre has put pieces of music into little cubby holes. When we think about the act of musicking, of songing, I think it breaks down some of those things because it removes the commodification of music. What if we did that in real life? What if we centered the artist instead of what the artist created? I think that could really change the game. It's one thing to say, this is, music by Caroline Shaw, whose sound and this piece of music fits our sort of aesthetic that we're trying to maintain. That's one thing. But wouldn't it be another thing to take all of her music and center her and platform it all? The stuff with Kanye West, the stuff that doesn't necessarily sound like there are orchestral strings and winds involved. I think taking that concept of songing, centering the act of making music instead of the pieces of music itself would be a huge thing in what we're trying to do in decolonizing these spaces. And I know a lot of folks aren't ready for that, but I don't know, that inspired something in me. I had never thought about songing or musicking, the act of, and centering the person instead of commodifying the creation of those actions.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that.
One other, just two quick things I want to share. We talked about, did we already talk about things out of tune or false tuning? Something that I learned.
You alluded to it.
Yeah. So on the panel was a woman of Korean descent as far as her, genealogy, but was adopted as a child to a family in the Netherlands. And that's how she identifies. So she talked a lot about identity and how identity is more than just genealogy, you know, what your family tree might say or what your 23andMe might say, but your actual community and your actual environment that you were growing up in. You know, just a really interesting conversation there. But something that she put me on to was the fact that in Germanic based languages, in the same way that we say out of tune when you know, when you're away from that 440 or whatever, other languages, they say false. You're singing falsely or playing falsely. That's not false. It's just outside of that Western European paradigm of being in tune and that whole thing. So, you know, it leaves me to think about what are the other ways in which our language is keeping us off track, you know, the ways that the colonization of our ears are keeping us off track. I'm going to do my best to stop using phrases like out of tune. I wonder, you know, and I'm sure there are many other things. Maybe there are things that you're thinking about. But the last thing I want to highlight from this summit, there was a speaker who said, in essence, I took notes as I was listening. I'm sure I didn't get it down verbatim, but what I ended up writing down here was, you can't learn to be yourself in classical music spaces because the art centers being someone else. That was something for me to hear. Let me read that again. You can't learn to be yourself in classical music spaces because the art centers being someone else. So those are my trills for this week. I'm talking to all of the musicians, especially those of you married, you know, still married to the definition of classical music that you were taught, that you were incorrectly taught. Think about the commodification of music and what it would mean to center the music-ing, the song-ing, centering the artists behind the music that we're platforming. What would that look like? What would that look like when we consider that whole person? I think it would change the conversation of art versus artist, for example, to center the person and not the music. I think there are benefits all over the place that we can that we'll be able to see if we can do that. Small pieces of our language out of tune. Let's phase that out. Let's continue to do this equity work by affirming that there are ways of tuning that are different than our own, and it doesn't make it out of tune. It just puts it out of the tradition of Western Europe, or I'll have to think about my new phrase, so-called out of tune or whatever. But that's something to think about. And again, finally, think about the ways in which classical music has kept you from evolving as a person and learning about yourself and being your true self because you're so busy. You're too busy trying to live up to the standards set by a culture that you don't belong to and that most of us don't have any proximity to. Let's think about that as we move forward, really break down these microaggressions, listen to each other, and work toward a better world. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.